can I dress for success?
All right. How's everybody doing? Everybody doing well? All right. Well, it's good to have you with us today. I appreciate you being here. It's good to have the platform finally finished. And the carpet looks good. And thank God for His faithfulness and provision for us as a growing church. Thank God for that. We have people coming and going, people sick, others traveling, but we're glad that you've chosen to be in the household this morning. And we're right here almost in the middle of summer, months, and then we'll start the fall activity. It'll come faster than you think, right, guys? It just gets quicker. But it is good to have you. I was able to get back here. Connie and them are still up in the mountains in West Virginia with the family, and she'll be back for our ice cream show social, our worship night on a week from this coming Wednesday night. So remember that great opportunity to be together as a church family. We'll have some fellowship and time on that 29th of June, I believe it is. And so anyway, I drove 14 hours on Friday, all the way from there straight back. So it was a long day that day. But I'm here and have a lot of work to do this week, so it all worked out together. All right, today we continue our studies, and Happy Father's Day. I'm getting all my texts. Happy Father's Day, and call you later. So they'll call me later this afternoon. So we'll have our Father's Day here. Jay and I started unintended Father's Day tradition, and we're Father's Day without our families. Okay, so that's what our family do to celebrate Father's Day. Lee Town. All right, and but today we have Jay's dad with us today. Isaac's coming back for Mount Grove football, so we're going to have Father's Day at the house today, right? And start a new tradition. Hopefully it'll be short-lived. Next year, I told Jay, next year you're getting off of work, okay? And have Father's Day with the family. Okay, but it's good. But today we get into a story that's going to really blow your mind a little bit. We're going to get it. We got into Jacob. You remember he's Jacob's ladder. Got into that. And then last week we talked about the idea of I just don't get it. Talking about how life sometimes does things to us, circumstances come, and just don't get it. And today, the title of the sermon is, This is the Way I See It. This is the way I see it. And I'm going to give us a little introduction, maybe a big introduction, and then we'll get right into the story. I'll do what I can to cut out all I can to keep it, tight. But on the other hand, I want to make sure you get the message today, and I'll do my best to do that. And so, oftentimes we find it hard to understand what God is doing in our lives when we look at the circumstances of our lives, whether they be good circumstances or whether they are challenging circumstances or whether they are terrible circumstances. So we cannot just get the idea that all circumstances are bad, but we need to know how to interpret what God is doing in our lives. And sometimes that doesn't happen as easily as you think it might. And so today's story, it's a wild story today. When we get into Leah and Rachel having boys and babies, okay? That's going to be the story. What happens to us, I don't know that we intend to do it, but do it. We intend to think about what we want. And then we begin to formulate an outcome. And then we fall in love with that outcome. And then we interpret everything that happens to us in light of our preferred future or of the outcome that we want. And so when we fall in love and embrace an outcome, then everything that comes in between here and the outcome, we view it so that we can get the outcome. Many times we deceive ourselves. And many times we'll say, this is what God is doing. And in reality, it isn't what God is doing. God is doing something. It just isn't what you think He's doing. And we're going to get into that today in our story. And so it's easy as Christians to miss what God is doing if we hold on to the wrong thing. We throw our hands up like last week and say, I don't get it. If we don't interpret life rightly, we will end up living life wrongly. We'll end up living our lives thinking we're with God, only to find out later we've gone from God. We had no idea what He was doing. And so we're now in the life of Jacob, and we're witnessing how God takes this self-absorbed conniver. Now that's what some scholars call him. I'm not sure he's as bad as that sounds. Because Jacob really is a lot like us. Or maybe more like us than we want to. But God's going to take this conniver, this guy who's just trying to get the right thing, the wrong way. And God has transformed, or is transforming him. He's given us this story. Now, how does God transform our lives in this powerful way? How do we see what God does with less than favorable circumstances? Now, we're taught to today, a lot of preachers today, they'll tell you you choose your preferred future. What do you want to be? What's your dream? We're taught, hey, let's figure all that out. Then once we figure that out, then we'll work backwards. And now we're going to begin to make everything happen to get what we want. I'm going to share some stories with you that are a little bit extreme. But I want to help you understand the idea that sometimes if we don't learn how to interpret life circumstances, we can get God wrong. And we can get what God is doing. Let me tell you this story. There was a man, the father, on this Father's Day. He was a father, he had a husband, and he had several children. And he was in business for himself. And he had lots of struggles. Some of you businessmen, small business owners, you would know what this is about, to get a business up and running. He had plenty of work, but just not quite enough work. So he struggled to make ends meet. But he was a faithful man, he was a faithful Christian man. He prayed, he worked hard to make his business work. And one quarter, he had failed to pay his IRS taxes on the company and of his employees. And he just forgot to do it. And then finally, a little while later, toward the end of the month, he found out that he had failed to do it, but he noticed he had some more money. And it kind of felt good to have some disposable money. Well, he forgot about it. And the next thing you know, several years went by, and he would not pay the IRS. And he had begun to think about it in his mind that, maybe God is blessing him with this. Because the IRS hadn't said anything. And maybe God is using this to be a blessing so he can help take care of his family. Amen? Our family. We're supposed to pay our debts. He began to deceive himself into thinking God may be helping him in this way. I don't know if this is going to work. They got me on a new system here. If it goes blank, we're just going to dismiss, okay? I have nothing to say unless it's right. And so, God might be using this to help him fulfill his responsibilities. And so, he just didn't do it. However, he got a letter in the mail some years later. And it was from the IRS. And it said, "What are you doing?" And then he calls his pastor to give him one. You never call before you do. It's calling after. You see, because we want what we want. Right? And we'll deceive ourselves. Could have got advice. I mean, he could have just made a phone call and said, do I really need to send this thing? But he didn't want to hear that. He'd fallen in love with an outcome. And he put money. And he deceived himself into thinking maybe this is the way God is. Here's another story. There was a woman who found herself in a very unloving marriage. She was not being assaulted in any way or hurt in that way. Her husband just wasn't living up to the promises that he had made, and she felt that he just wasn't doing it. And he wasn't living up to those promises, and things were not turning out the way she wanted it. And this could be vice versa. And she began to feel that she needed to leave him because this is not what she signed up for. She's a Christian. She was not happy. She felt she deserved more. And she happened to see another couple, and she noticed that he was treating his wife better than what he was treating her. At least that's what she saw. Right? Don't see it all. That's what she wanted to see. And so she was struggling about it, and so she walked into the Christian bookstore, and of course, she's struggling, and beautiful picture of a gate, opened gate. She told herself, that's a sign from God, that it's okay to go a new direction. God's opening a door for her. Besides that, it just so happened that another man had come into her life who treated her a lot better than her own husband. You see, she was interpreting it the way she wanted it to turn out. She fell in love with that actor. So she interpreted it that God is opening circumstances to make it happen. Now, those are extreme, and we may not have stories like that, but I have a story as a kid. When I was little, I remember in McDonald's, back in 1967, I believe, I know this. This is a great time of life. I remember the first day they brought out the Big Mac. Look it up. It was 1960. I remember my first Big Mac. I was about, 69? I'd be about 12 years old. I remember my first Big Mac. I was helping at the church, the youth pastor, and I was helping clean up the church, and he said, hey, come on, I'll take you to McDonald's. And they had a Big Mac, and I had my first Big Mac. I remember driving over on Hannah and Madison. It's still there. It's not the same building, but it's still there. And I walked in. But I remember we stopped there one time, and my mom sent me in with a $10 bill. I ordered a sack, and back at $10, you could feed me that. Now it takes $100. But then it took $10. I walked back with $20. Of course, I thought God blessed me. Right? As a 12-year-old kid. Mom, here's your 10 back. I've got 10 for myself. You see? So all I'm rationalizing, Mom said, you get right back in there and tell him. You see? That's what we do. That's not yours. Somebody's going to pay for it. Somebody made a mistake. Somebody's going to get shorted on their paycheck. No, you get back in. Now, she didn't say all that. That's what's being said. So I take it back in. They said, no, we didn't make a mistake. I come back out. I said, oh, Mom, no mistake. She said, take it back in. This little kid. Mom's not going to get out of the car yet. I come back the second time, and she gets out of the car. And she goes in and said, this isn't right. Well, I took the phone number down, 784-9563. And so we get there. They call that night. Sure enough, there was a mistake. The next day, Mom takes the money back. She's teaching her son. She's teaching her children honesty and integrity. Right? But see, how many of you say, well, I understand that. How many of you put in a Coke machine and you put $1 in or $1.50, whatever it is now, and all of a sudden you don't get a Coke and you're beating the fire out of that thing. Right? And so you would beat that. And so here you are with that Coke machine, and if you don't get their Coke, what are you going to do? You're going to call 1-800 number. You're going to find out what this is, right? But if you get back $5 in change, yeah, you hit the jackpot. You're not calling a 1-800. You see what I'm saying? It's the way you're interpreting. See, when you don't get your coat, the devil's tempted. And when you get $5 back, God is blessing. Right? That's the way sometimes. What I am saying, here's the point. We all interpret our life events. You're interpreting them today some way. Maybe somebody's lonely, and then somebody sits next to them. And you interpret it, God must be happy. So when life is not good or life is not playing out, and your preferred future is not in reach, then we try to interpret life in a way. And we all must learn how to read life well. We all must have the proper theology of God, or we're going to hold on to the wrong things. The second point here is Jacob is being transformed from a deceiver to a dependent follower of God. Jacob, can you imagine this? When God identified himself, they said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and question mark." Okay. Jacob. Jacob is now going to start the process of transformation. And down the road, that question mark's going to be Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. But in God's mind, already God was identifying himself with his chosen man long before this chosen man became the man of God. Amazing. So keep that in mind. And remember last week we said, what does it look like for God to be with us? Because when we think God's with us, we think He's good. With God with us, man, we're going to get all we want, all we need. That God with us, God with us. And last week we saw what it looked like. It meant for Jacob, working 7 years to get Leah, he was tricked and lied to. He had to work 7 more years to get Rachel. 14 years for the wife that he wanted. And now he's got both wives. And now he's got a mess. So we must learn to understand God being with us based on what he has said, not what it seems to us. Right? We must learn to see God with us based upon what he said. Now, with that in mind, let's go to Genesis chapter 29 and verse 31, and we'll read the story. Right? And let's just read the story, and let's get some things, and then I'll try to wrap it up by 12:30. Okay? Genesis 29:30. Genesis 29:30. When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, you see, Jacob worked for Rachel 14. Right? Yeah, Leah after 7. That's not who he wanted. Wanted Rachel. So he's got 14 years. And he has 2 wives. So what did God do here? It says right here. It says God enabled her to conceive. Now, where the story's going to get wild. It's going to go crazy, man. But Rachel remained childless. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son, and she named him Reuben. Why? Because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now. That's what she was seeing. That was her preferred outcome. Right? She longed for her husband to love her. Well, in that day, they needed sons. Sons was a big thing. They had passed everything down. Verse 33, she conceived again. So Leah not only has one, God's opening her womb. And she conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, because the Lord heard that I am not loved. Now, there's nowhere in Scripture that says that, but that's how she felt. It's telling us how she's interpreting. God didn't say that's why he did it. Leah is saying that's why he did it. Because the Lord heard that I am not loved, he gave me this one too. So she named him Simeon. Again she conceived, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, now at last my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. So I'm going to name him Levi. And she conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, this time I will praise the Lord. So she named him Judah. Then she stopped having children. Verse 30, or chapter 30. Now when Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob children, she became jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, give me children or I'll die. Ever felt that desperate? Jacob became angry with her and he said, am I in the place of God who has kept you from having? Today you just say, what can I do about it? I didn't cause this. Then she said, here's Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her so that she can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her. And that was a custom in that day. That's how vital it was to have sons to carry on the family name and the family sustenance, the shepherding and all the business and everything. It was done in that way. That's just the way it was. And so, if a woman was barren, then she could have her handmaid come and have children for her. So now we're talking about some kind of surrogacy. And so my servant, sleep with her so that she can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her. So she gave her the Bilhah as a wife. Jacob slept with her, and she became pregnant and bore him a son. And Rachel said, God has vindicated me. God didn't say he vindicated me. She said God had vindicated. And have listened to my plea and give me a son. So because of that, I'm going to name him Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, I have a great struggle with my sister, and I have won. So, so I'm going to name him Naphtali. And that means wrestle. They're wrestling. I'm going to win. Verse 9, when Leah saw that she had stopped having children, she took her servant and said, so well, if you can give her your handmaid, I'll give her my handmaid. So give Zilpah and gave that to Jacob, gave her to Jacob. And Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob the son. And Leah said, what good fortune. That's what she did. So she named him Gad. And Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, how happy am I? The woman called me happy. So I'm going to name him Asher. Happy. You see the way she sees it? And during wheat harvest, Reuben went out to the fields and found some mandrake plants. Now, go study mandrake plants. It's a passion. It's like an aphrodisiac. It's a fruit they would take to produce fertility or this kind of sensual thing. So they grow mandrakes. Today you just go to the pharmacy. So don't look down at it. But you mandrakes. That was big. And so he brought it to the mother Leah, and Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But Leah said to her, wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? You see, she's still not being loved, even though she named her kids. Love, happiness, right? Will you take my son's mandrakes too? You going to take everything I have? Very well, Rachel said. He can sleep with you. Jacob can sleep with you tonight to return for your son's mandrakes. So when Jacob came in from the fields that evening, Leah went out to him and said, you must sleep with me, because I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. That's a great relationship. So he slept with her that night. God listened to Leah. She became pregnant and bore Jacob a fifth son. And Leah said, God has rewarded me. That's the way we see it. See, we find what we want, and we interpret everything. Giving my servant to my husband. So she named him Issachar. And we'll get into those names quickly. Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. And Leah said, God has presented me a precious gift. This time my husband will treat me with honor. See, he hasn't. She said that's why God was doing it, but it hadn't happened. So she named him Zebulon. Sometime later, she gave birth to a daughter, named her Dinah, which is the same as Dan. And then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. And she became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, God has taken away my disgrace. She named him Joseph and said, may the Lord add to me another son. So she gets Joseph, but she wants more. Does that sound like anybody else in this room? God will answer your prayer, and you'll want. Right? Always want. Now, I told you it was wild. And this is a great family that we ought to emulate. Aren't we supposed to follow the people of the Bible? No, there's a lot more going on here than you think. And these people are messing it up. God's will. Even with people who have flaws. Here we have women competing to have sons for their husbands. So the naming of these children is kind of significant. But maybe not in the way, because when I grew up in my studies, it was always that these names would mean things, and you could tell what God was doing by the names and stuff, places and stuff. But in this case, I agree with the scholars today that are thinking this through. I don't agree with it. I think these names are telling us what these women wanted, not what God was doing. And I want to bring that home to us so that we can be a people who can better interpret the circumstances of our lives. And interpret them in a way that might help us know exactly what God is doing. Even when it's not fun. Even when we don't get what we want. Remember Abram, father, became Abraham, father of many. Right? Multitude, because God said, I'm going to bless you and I'm going to have you. Your seed is going to outnumber the stars and the sands of the sea, and I'm going to bless you. You're going to have great nation. And Sarah laughed. Remember Sarah laughed, so she named him Isaac. Isaac means laughter. It reminds her of the joy that came to her heart when she had him. Leah bears her first son and says, look, it's Reuben. The word Reuben means look or looked. God has looked down on me. And so as she's seen my misery. That's how she interpreted it. The second son, God saw that I've been hated, so he'll give me a gift. And the word Simeon means heard, or God heard. The third son, now Jacob, will join me. So Levi means bound to. Jacob didn't at this time. The fourth son, Jacob had not responded, so she names him Judah. She said, I'm just going to praise the Lord. Rachel sees she's losing, so she gives Bilhah, remember? So she named him Dan, judged. God has favored. Leah sees this, and she thinks she cannot have anyone else, so she gives Zilpah and does what Rachel does, and Gad, and so she says, I'm fortunate. Unless I missed one. No, Naphtali, rest. There you go back, you're right. Starting with to win another son. So I have Naphtali, or to wrestle. And then Leah sees this and thinks she cannot have any more. So Gad. Then she has Asher, and that makes her happy. She's happy. Now she has 6 sons. Now Leah bears herself. God is paying me back for all the good things. So I'm going to name him Issachar, which means wages. God is paying me back. That's nothing. Now others will honor me rightly. The last one was Zebulon, honor. So Rachel gets Joseph. Add to, that's what it means. I just quickly want to go over those because I could take 2 more hours. So just want to get this. You understand how to name these sons. Get what's going on here. These women are in their own world and they have their preferred outcome and they're trying to take the circumstances to get it. So I don't fall into the category of people thinking these names represent what God's doing. I think these names represent what these women do. to happen. Leah wants to be loved. That's what her heart desires. And their preferred future is laid out in the naming of children. It's what they expected. It's what they thought God would do for them. But it isn't what happened in life. We don't know about the time of this. We know that Jacob worked 7 years for Leah, 7 years for Rachel. So we don't know when, but it took about 8 to 12 years to have all this happen. So amid Leah's discomfort and Rachel's discomfort in life, things are happening trying to. Do you understand what I'm trying to tell you? Have you lived long enough to try to figure out what God is doing, figure out how things are happening? So they go in with Reuben and Simeon, Judah, Issachar, and all of them. Here's the point. It is more about how life should go, not what is going on. And I think I do this sometimes. I think all of us do. I mean, sometimes we might have a Reuben. Life is not going the way we think it should. Life is not getting what we think we ought to have. Maybe we feel in love like Leah did. And so things just aren't working out. And so we name Reuben. God has looked on me, seen my anguish, my sadness, and He's blessed me. Sometimes we'll have a Simeon day, right? Maybe we'll have a day where God gives me something. And so we see that God has heard my cry. Or maybe a Levi day. We may have a Judah day. We may have the same kind of days that these ladies went through. Maybe we'll have a Joseph day. God's been good to me. So we'll have these kinds of days. But I think sometimes our prayer life reflects what we want rather than what God is doing. Because realize this, Jacob isn't the man God's going to make him in. He's going to transform him, and you aren't either. God is transforming you. The circumstances of your life God is using to make you like the Son. And Jesus Christ Himself suffered. Well, if He suffered, we're going to suffer. That's what it means to be Christ-like. We become like Christ. And it takes a lot of pressure. It takes a lot of work. It takes molding. It takes transforming. And the way these women named their children seemed to me to reflect what they wanted, not so much what God was doing. I don't think that God is doing it for the reasons these women are thinking. It's happening. They're feeling what they feel, but He's not doing it for the reasons they think. They think it's doing so that people will be drawn to them, or that they might be vindicated, or they might be happy. But the reason it's all happening is because God promised Abraham a long time ago that I will make you rich, that I will give you descendants. Why is this happening? The reason this is happening is because God is working out His plan and fulfilling His promise. Why does it sound so dirty and messed up? It's because God only has dirty stuff. Right? Would you guys have done any better back in that day? No, because we don't do our best. Right? We want to do right, but man, I'll tell you, we still see life the way the flesh sees it. So God is working out His plans and fulfilling His promises. And today we're hearing, you have a dream. If you want to do this and be successful, you do this. And whatever the outcome you want, and we're being preached to today. Go on YouTube. You can hear it. We're being preached to. Man, you can be anything you want to be. Get your outcome. Where do you want to go? And then you start giving your money to places so you get something back. Right? Then you start serving so that God will show favor. Right? And so you start doing things for God so that God will do something. That's what we're preaching. I think that maybe we're seeing a little bit. this because he's made a promise. And he's doing it for his glory. He promised that anyone who is born again and saved will be conformed to the image of his dear Son. And if you're born again and saved, and you have God with you, that's the best place you could be. Because life is going to get tough. Life is going to have some good times, and life is going to have some bad times. But God is with you. So, as we wrap it up, number one, how I see things may not be what God is doing. Right? You have to learn to interpret. When I stopped and thought about this, I realized how it described my own life. I remember all the bad things. Why I left Indianapolis and I went to Jacksonville, and then now I'm here. I'm thinking, I remember what I was thinking. God must be doing this, only to find out that He had nothing to do with it. You see, what God was doing was transforming. I wish I'd have been an easier subject. Right? I wish I'd have been a quicker learner. I wish I'd let him transform me all the way back to Indianapolis then, right? But he couldn't. He had to take me to Jacksonville to transform me again, and then he had to bring me here. I hope to finish it, okay? Because it's been a long road, 40 years. So I hope that I'm on my last leg of transformation, right, guys? I know I'm not leaving, right? So here it is. Transformation. I thought it was because he was blessing me. He gave me a big church, and we built a big church. I thought he was doing this and that. I thought this and that, and all of a sudden, man, life got tough. All of a sudden, things didn't turn out. That's when you know. See? You see, sometimes we want to be happy, and all we know is happiness, not happiness. See, happiness is when things happen well, I feel good. And when things happen bad, I feel bad. That's called happiness. Right? Most people never get to happiness. Happiness comes, it's like a joy that comes, even in the bad times. There is a peace and a stability. Oh, there may not be laughter. There's a peace and a contentment. God. God is with you. So, don't misread life. When you pray this week, ask God to give you eyes of understanding so that you don't misinterpret life. When we fall in love with an outcome, we will get it wrong. You have to lose your will before you know His will. As long as you have a will, you will see to it that it is done. If God is never... See, most people think God's will is the happy times, the great times, the financial bliss, the success. No. If God has ever told you to do something you don't want to do, now you know what it's all. You see, we think God's will is telling us to do things. No, God's will is telling Abraham, leave everything behind. The will of God is tough. The will of God is not necessarily. The will of God will put you in a place that you never thought you would. Make you happy. Yeah? Content. So, don't get in love with an outcome. Live every day as unto the Lord. Second, the thing that God is doing to accomplish His purpose is to accomplish His purpose. Whatever God is doing in your life right now, whether it be sickness, whether it be in your marriage, or whether it be in your job, whatever it is, God is working on you so that you be transformed. Because it's the best. You see, He's not making these ladies' lives work out. They're still all messed up. They gave good names to the kids. Right? Here's the point. Ultimately, be for them. Ultimately, it will be. God's going to change. Number three, the way that I may interpret what God is doing changes. Nor will it prevent His promises from being. Jacob gets his kids as God promised. And Joseph is born to one day from Joseph. He's going to be the one who preserves these future Israelites from famine, failure. Isn't that amazing? Joseph is going to be the one. And from this family that you and I just read about, from this family, one day is going to come Moses, who's going to set people free. And from this family, from these ladies, from their kids, is going to come Jesus Christ, Messiah. Isn't that amazing? That's what God's doing. They thought God was all interested in them being happy. And God was just simply preserving alive so that the world would see. So where are you in life today? Right now. Whether it's unfair parents, right? Teenagers think the parents are unfair, unappreciated, happy marriage, at work. Hold on to God, because it's in those trials that God will make you into a new person. Be careful how you're treated. I'm going to tell you this last story. It's only 11:32. Right out here. This is it. Close your Bibles. I'll tell you a story that gives a great illustration. Now you understand what I've preached to you today and what I taught. Is that this is the way they see it. But in the end, it's God working His plan. None of these women realized that the Messiah was going to come. One of those boys. None of them realized that Moses was going to come. They never saw, right? They just saw what they could see here and now. That's why we're working together, because we don't know what's going to be from our work together. How many people are going to be blessed decades from now? Because you and I were faithful in the circumstances. We gave them to God. There was a man named Horatio Spafford, born in 28, I think, in New York City. He moved to Chicago later, Presbyterian church, elder, wife, 5 kids. In 1870, his 4-year-old son died with scarlet fever. He was left with 4 daughters. Then the Chicago fire took place in 1871. It's historically, read about it. It devastated the city. 90,000 people were out of homes, and 300 people were killed in the Chicago fires. He loses all of his business and his home and everything. Rather than live in despair and complain, they began to help the people around him. He and his family began to help people in need. And in the process of helping people in need, he ran into a man named D.L. Moody, a famous pastor, a famous evangelist, Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. And so he ran across him. In 1873, just a year later, they decided they would travel with D.L. Moody to Europe in an evangelistic crusade, because back in that day, these great evangelists, they traveled preach the word of God, and people were saved. They arrived in New York City to get on the ship to Europe. But when they arrived in New York City, he got word from his business back in Chicago that he had to go back, take care of some business before he left. It's not like flying back and forth. So it's long trips. So he takes his wife Anna and the 4 girls and he puts them on the ship. He says, I'll go back home and I'll come back to you as quickly as possible. On November 21st, 1873, at 2 a.m. in the morning, the ship ran into an ocean liner and his family sank with the ship within 12 minutes. 307 passengers, 246 drowned, and the only one of his family that survived was his wife, Hale. And she survived, but the 4 daughters were killed. And she was quoted as saying, God gave me 4 daughters. Now they have been taken from me. One day I will understand. When she reached England, she wired a message back to Horatio Spafford, and it said, saved alone, what should I do? Saved alone, what should I do? You see, she chose not to interpret life based on her struggle. Horatio decided to take the next ship across to meet his grieving wife. And when the ship crossed the place where the previous ship had sank, the captain came to Horatio and said, here's the spot where your daughters died. We can only imagine what was going on the water that day to realize somewhere are his daughters. And he's trying to interpret the circumstances of his life. Later in life, he wrote this: I rely exclusively on the power of God. I am a miracle of grace. Extreme grace. And at that spot, he took a piece of paper out and he began to write words. Later, those words were put in the music, and you've sung them over the decades. When peace like a river attendeth my way. When sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, you have taught me to say, it is well. It is well. Could you have said that? Learn how to interpret the circumstances of your life. You see, Spafford learned this. Today we want to know about your story. You know what Horatio Spafford learned? He learned it's not his story. It's God's story. Written in Him. So it's not our story. It's His story. And He's going to use you to tell it.